and also quite a large map, but it also is interesting that it shows some of the what was considered the important buildings in the town at the time. So, which includes the the Grand Bank, which so banks had not become national banks yet. The Lee Mansion, which is up in the corner, and 4 churches. So these were what, as I say, what was considered important in Marblehead at the time. And next slide. So the 19th century was a time of enormous change in Marblehead, and this is something that we see throughout the century. Of course, we see throughout history. But one of the things that went on all through the 19th century was a struggle for people to figure out how they were going to support themselves, how they're going to make a living from fishing or merchant ships or being shoemakers, shipbuilders. That it was a constant struggle, and there were national events like the War of 1812, the Civil War, and the Spanish-American War that affected the town, but maintaining a stable and dependable source of income was the recurring theme as the economy continually reinvented itself throughout the 19th century. So this is a map of Marblehead in the 1830s, and this brings up a point of what was going on in the 19th century at end of the 18th and the early 19th century in Marblehead. The town was extremely poor. It was devastated by the American Revolution. The fishing fleet was in ruins. And one of the things that's interesting about this map is you see, of course, how concentrated the actual town was right around the harbor and what we now sort of refer to as the historic district. But off to the left of that is quite prominent almshouse or poorhouse. So this, as I say, represents the fact that Marblehead was so extremely poor at this time, and many people, many women and children were left without any support, and so there was a poorhouse that existed through almost all of the 19th century. Next slide. This time period, the early 19th century, is the federal period in the United States. So after the United States was founded, it was figuring out what the goals and certainly very high level of goals of what people wanted the country to be. They chose the American eagle at this time as the symbol of the United States. And so that's why you see that it's very characteristic of the federal period, but of course we still continue to see it now. And Benjamin Franklin was very opposed to the American eagle as the national symbol. He wanted it to be the turkey. He thought the eagle was a nasty bird, but he was overruled, and the eagle became the symbol. Next slide. Now, one of the things that we continue to struggle with is the fact that the Declaration of Independence created a free country, but did not include Black Americans in that freedom. And this is an illustration from Samuel Greenleaf Whittier's poem, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? And so this theme, of course, has run through all of our of the history of the United States, and is still not completely resolved. Next slide. So in the early 19th century, one of the things that was happening was that France and England were at war with each other. England was in desperate need of sailors, and they began stopping American ships and impressing the sailors on board into the British Navy. So once they were captured and taken onto a British ship, it was virtually impossible for them to get away or get back to their own ships. And so this was a huge embarrassment to the United States, and it was quite a lot of controversy. So Thomas Jefferson passed the embargo of 1807, that ordered all British vessels out of American waters with the idea of stopping the impressment. Well, unfortunately, it was a disaster, and it really did. It slowed down trade and everything. And this political cartoon of the time is showing King George III on the left and Napoleon on the right, and they're basically robbing Jefferson of his money and as I say, it was very unpopular and financially not a good idea. Next slide. So it stalled both merchant trade and fishing because fishing vessels were also they were capturing men off fishing vessels as well. And it created even more economic hardship for the town of Marblehead. Elbridge Gerry, who was in Washington at the time, was beside himself because of this embargo, and he was very much against it. There was so much negative feeling about it, particularly in New England, that there was a discussion of New England seceding from the United States because of it. It ended in 1809, and Elbridge Gerry, who is certainly the most famous son of Marblehead, was still in Washington and became the vice president under James Madison in 1812. Next slide. And so this is just repeating this. This is a scene of these soldiers being captured. One of the things that the British claimed was that many of the Americans on these ships had been born in England, so that legally they were English citizens and they could capture them. But it's estimated that over 9,000 Americans were caught and forced to serve in the British Navy. Next slide. And again, so this is not popular, but because during the War of 1812, which was then, so Jefferson went out of office. Madison declared war, the War of 1812. It was a kind of a daring move to declare war against England at that time, since the United States had virtually no navy, very small navy. But it was a kind of a calculated risk, because since England was so preoccupied with the Napoleonic Wars, he thought they might be able to pull it off. This war was also not popular because, again, it interrupted trade, it interrupted fishing, but the Marbleheaders did go to fight, and many of them became privateers. They received what was called a letter of marque, and this is a picture of an actual letter of marque issued by James Madison, and this gave permission to go to act as a privateer, which was not the same thing as a pirate. It was basically a deputized naval vessel. So next slide. During the War of 1812, there were many of the Americans that were captured in battles were sent to Dartmoor prison, and there were over 600 men from Marblehead that were imprisoned at Dartmoor over the time. This is a map drawn by Glover Broughton, who was from Marblehead, and he drew this. This is actually a print made from the drawing that he made. So it was kind of a circular prison, and he made this drawing, and then it was made into a print when he came back home. Glover Broughton survived the War of 1812, came home again to Marblehead, was a successful ship captain, and then he eventually retired from the sea and became a Marblehead selectman. And so he lived at quite an old age and was and helped men from the War of 1812 to get any pension money that might be available to them, because many of them couldn't read and write. So that was something that he did for his fellow Marbleheaders. Next slide. Now, one of the most famous aspects relating to Marblehead in the War of 1812 is about Old Ironside. So in 1814, Marbleheaders were able to watch this amazing chase of Constitution was being chased by two British frigates, and they were coming up the coast, and there was a Marblehead man on board, and the captain delegated him to bring the vessel into Marblehead Harbor, which was a tricky passage for, especially for a larger ship. So he was able, they were able to bring her safely into Marblehead, and the British vessels that were chasing decided it was too risky to come into the harbor. They weren't sure how much, whether there was cannons at the fort. They could see cannons, but they actually weren't as much of a threat but they just weren't willing to take that chance. So this established this kind of bond between Marblehead and the Constitution that still continues to this day. And people in Marblehead feel very fondly towards the old Ironsides, and vice versa. The old Ironsides has come 3 times to Marblehead in the 20th century. Next slide. So after the War of 1812, there was an expansion in trade and commerce. Merchant ships from Marblehead went all over the world. Marblehead was, of course, not as active in the China trade, but they did. But Marblehead men went to China primarily on Salem ships. But Marblehead merchant vessels went into Russia. They went all over Europe, into South America, and so it was really quite an amount of European and trade outside of the United States. And also, of course, the train came to Marblehead. This made a big change that became an even greater change with shoemaking and the ability to transport the goods. But the train came to Marblehead in 1839. Okay, next slide. Oh, anyway. Yeah. So despite all the other kinds of trade, other ways of making a living that were beginning to develop, codfish really remained the mainstay of New England economy through the 19th century in most places, not and in Marblehead as well, although we're going to talk about why it didn't remain so strong in Marblehead. But as you may know, on the State House in Boston, there's a golden cod, and the cod really was what established the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Marblehead, and was certainly important. Next slide. So it was at the end of the 18th and into the 19th century that Marblehead vessels began going to the Grand Banks, and you can see this enormous distance from Marblehead all the way out to the Grand Banks. And this painting, which is owned by the Historical Commission, this is a big merchant vessel that's with the square rig vessel, but the little sailing schooners are the one, and the dory are beside it. So you can see the difference in the size. These are very small wind-powered vessels that took about a week of sailing day and night to get to the Grand Banks. And they went to the Banks because, as you probably may know, every place that's called the Banks, like the Stellwagen and George's Banks, are basically they're mountain ranges that are below the surface of the ocean, but they're high enough, close enough to the surface that sunlight can go through, and plankton can grow there, and so that brings fish who come and feed at the Banks, and they lay their eggs, and so that's why fishermen go to all the different banks to fish. But the Grand Banks was really the greatest place for fishing. And they next slide. They got these fish that were, as you can see, the fish next to the little boy, enormous, absolutely enormous fish. They went up in these fishing schooners, and then they had dories that they went out in every day and fished. And when the dory was filled, they came back to what they called the mothership. They loaded the fish into the ship and did that for several months until they filled the hold, and then they came back to Marblehead. Next slide. So, and just before I talk about this, so that was the product from Marblehead for over 200 years, was the fish that were caught and then salted and dried. Because of course, at that time, before refrigeration, this was a very valuable, very desirable thing for people to have. Now, the Great Gale of 1846 was devastating to the Marblehead fishing industry. There were probably about 25 or so fishing vessels, and so there may have been more at different times, but 11 vessels were lost in this huge storm that was, of course, unexpected. The men in the fishing schooners woke up in the morning and they could see the storm coming, but they were at least 100 miles from shore, so there was nothing to do. And so once so it raged on, and when in the next morning they found that 11 vessels were lost. This is a painting by J.O.J. Frost, which is at the Marblehead Museum in the Frost Gallery. 65 men and 43 widows. 65 men who died, leaving 43 widows and 155 fatherless men. So this was an enormous tragedy. There was nobody in Marblehead at that time, approximately population of 5,000 or so, that wasn't affected in one way or another. This is the obelisk, is the monument that's on Burial Hill that lists all the names of the men that were lost at sea. Next slide. So it was certainly, people continued to fish. It wasn't, things didn't stop immediately after that, but the fishing industry began to wane, and shoemaking became more and more an opportunity or an option for people, for a variety of reasons. Most fishermen had always done some shoemaking, but they didn't. And they did piecework. Next slide. Next slide. And so for a long time, for about the first half of the 19th century, people worked from these little 10-footers. That continued even when there were factories, but the 10-footers were basically 10 by 10 foot little sheds, and this is where men, primarily men, worked in the 10-footers, and they often went together and bought leather and shared their tools and that sort of thing. So this is an example of what they did, and they went in and worked in these sheds and produced handmade shoes. Next slide. So this is interesting that in 1807, a man's pay for 15 pair of shoes was $6.25, and for women it was half that amount. By the mid 1800s, a more traditional factory system was established, and there were major factories built in Marblehead. This was the Industrial Revolution, and the sewing machine really made this mass production possible. So it was the invention of the sewing machine in the late 1840s that really sort of propelled shoemaking. And it certainly in this area, and Lynn remained the shoemaking capital of the United States for well into the 20th century. But and the Civil War also drove a demand for shoes and boots. And it's interesting to note that in 1882, there were 67 shoe factories in Marblehead. Next slide. These are some of the workers in the shoe factory. And that's all. Next slide. So the shoemaking was very, very successful for a relatively short period of time. But the first fire, so these factories were all over. They were primarily in the Five Corners area, and where the Warwick Theater is, and in that area, because that's where the train came in. The train came into where National Grand Bank is now. So and of course they used the train to ship the shoes out. But of course all the factories were powered with and lit by gaslight, and so it was certainly dangerous conditions. The first fire took place in 1877, and the second was in 1888. Next slide. So just to conclude about the shoemaking, the reason that it was so popular for all of these fishermen to turn to shoemaking was that this was the opportunity to get paid on a weekly basis, as opposed to how fishermen had been paid, which was not getting any money until the fish were sold. So anyway, but that, as I say, that didn't last forever. So during the 19th century, the Underground Railroad was active. Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the book by Harriet Beecher Stowe, is considered one of the things that really informed many people. It's a fictional story. It's very melodramatic, but for many people who really didn't understand about slavery, or they weren't familiar with it, it created quite a feeling that this was a wrong thing. This is a photograph of Frederick Douglass, who came to speak in Marblehead twice, and was a slave himself, and he had escaped. He taught himself to read and write. He was quite a brilliant man, and he and many other people came to talk to abolitionist societies and encourage people to fight against slavery. Next slide. And the map in the center shows the underground, the route of the Underground Railroad, more or less. So that and slaves came to town sometimes by train. There was a whole system on the real trains service that supported the Underground Railroad, and the slaves were referred to as packages, and the conductors were sometimes real conductors and sometimes people who were helping. And when they would come to a place where they slowed down, they used a lantern. This is a lantern from the Marblehead Museum collection from the Eastern Railroad, and they would signal. And they would slow the train way down, and the slaves could jump, and they're usually only like a few at a time, jump off the train, and someone would be there to meet them and hide them. I think so in the upper left corner is a picture of a man named Henry Box Brown. Box it was his sort of nickname, but he was an escaped slave who his wife and children were sold away from him, and he determined that he was going to escape. So with the help of some people he escaped, and then with the help of some sympathetic supporters, they built a box for him and put him in the box. There was a couple little holes so he could get some air, and he was shipped to Philadelphia, where he would be able to be free. And so so this is an illustration of them unpacking the box. And the story is that Henry Box Brown stood up out of the box and said, "Good afternoon, gentlemen." He went on to be quite an important speaker for abolition and anti-slavery as well. Next slide. So one of the things that was going on in the middle of the 19th century was these clipper ships. And the clipper ships were very, very fast. They were built for speed. They were built because of the gold rush in California. So they basically didn't really carry cargo as much as they carried passengers. And speed was critical to get there as fast as possible and find gold as quickly as possible. So this vessel called the Flying Cloud was built in Boston, and Captain Josiah Perkins Creasy, who was from Marblehead, and he and his wife grew up together, and they sailed together. She was his navigator, and they were already well known for being an excellent captain and navigator. They were noted for the speed, and so they were chosen to be the captain and navigator for the Flying Cloud, and they broke the record. This was a lot of betting went on the speed of these ships, and so it was very successful financially for a lot of people because they broke this record, making it in 89 days, which is about almost 20 days less than it had been the record before. And they actually broke their own record again 2 years later. Next slide. So there was also shipbuilding going on in Marblehead. This is the hull that's being constructed. And this was in what is, of course, logically known as the shipyard district. And in this area, they were building a fair amount of ships in the second half of the 19th century, and to supply the workers to do all this, there were Irish immigrants who were coming into town. Of course, there were no Roman Catholic churches in Marblehead, so this was when the Star of the Sea Church was built. The postcard is of the first Star of the Sea Church, which was eventually replaced by the church that we know as the Star of the Sea, but that was when it was founded. Next slide. And this is a map showing a close-up of that area, of the shipyard area, and you can see how open it is. You can see Skinner's Head, which is where Glover Landing is now, and where hotels would be later on. And this Fish Fence Hill, this is where they put the dried fish. That fish fences was what the fish were dried on. And you can see Commercial Street, which is of course still there. And a lot of the, aside from the shipbuilding, there was rope making and sail making and other activities down there. Okay, next slide. So Marblehead in the Civil War, I'm going to talk about this just a little bit, but one of the great opportunities to learn more about it is at the Civil War Museum that's in the old townhouse, and that will be open, I believe, every Saturday this summer. And I think that's something well worth going to visit. This is a little jacket of a drummer boy who was in the Civil War from Marblehead, and so it was given to the GAR. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the drummer boys were extremely important. This is the last war that they were really actively used, but they basically they drummed the commands of what the soldiers were supposed to do. So they would drum different beats, and that would indicate which way the soldiers should march, and that sort of thing, or when to attack and that sort of thing. Okay, next slide. So the Marblehead was very active in the Civil War, sent many men, and many people at home were also there were women who prepared boxes of bandages, and they baked things and sent actual food to the front, as well as having charitable events. So so the war ended in 1865 finally, and the bells in Marblehead rang in celebration, and very sadly, less than a week later, the bells rang in very slowly and solemnly, because Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. Next slide. So this is something that you can see, as I say, in the old townhouse. That Marblehead's GAR post number 82 is named after the the town's first Civil War casualty, John P. Goodwin. And the meeting room, what's unique about this space is the meeting room is exactly as it was when the last Civil War veterans left it in the 1930s. So this was a place of, it was essentially a men's club. You actually had to be, even if you were a veteran, you had to be voted to be join it. But the veterans that met there did support orphans and widows and men that were wounded who couldn't work any longer. So it was, the GAR stands for the Grand Army of the Republic, was founded for both Union and Confederate soldiers. So and their goal was to reunite the country, but there were more of GAR posts in the North and in the South. Next slide. So in 1876, Abbott Hall was built, and this is photographs from a stereoscopic viewer. So that's why there's two of them. And when you put them in the viewer, it made it a sort of a three-dimensional effect. Next slide. Okay, well, I was going to talk about, I mentioned that, Benjamin Abbott gave the money to build a new town hall. The old townhouse had been the town hall before. It had gotten too small. Abbott was a cooper. He had, and he built, thank you, they made barrels. And it's interesting to think about that barrels were enormously important in the 18th and 19th century because of so many things being put on vessels. If you think about, if you ever go and stand on the dock beside a big sailing ship, you see that, it would be quite very high to lift boxes up onto the deck of the ship and then get them back down and get them down into the hold. But the barrel shape allowed them to be rolled up the gangplanks and then back down in. So anything that was put into a wooden barrel could also have gone into a box, but it was the shape that was the important thing about them. And Benjamin Abbott was a very important and successful cooper and made a lot of money, and he gave this money to the town. Next slide. In Abbott Hall is also the Spirit of 76 painting by Archibald Willard, which was painted for the bicentennial of 1876, and which toured around the United States and was a very popular painting. And it was donated to the town by General John Devereux, who was from Marblehead. Next slide. The bell at Abbott Hall was given by J.J.H. Gregory, who was known as the Seed King, and he was a school teacher who made first success was with Hubbard squash seeds, and then he began to cultivate all kinds of other seeds and had these seed factories. He also made a tremendous amount of money, and these are some of what were known as the seed girls, who worked in the seed factories, and they had their picture taken. But Gregory was quite a philanthropist. No one knew until long after his death that he sent boxes of books for over 25 years to Black schools and colleges in the South, which he did anonymously. Next slide. This is a map of Marblehead in 1882. You can see that it's starting to populate and be a bit more, the town is a bit more spread out. Next slide. And these are details from that map. So this is Abbott Hall, is in the first upper left slide. The next slide is the shoe factories. This is the Five Corners area. And the third image is the gas house beach. Of course, by 1882, many buildings were being lit by gas. And the lower left is a steam-powered vessel, which was also changing. So course, there were still many sailing ships, but there were steamships as well. And the in the lower right is the train station. So that is where the National Grand Bank is now. And so these are just some details to show the changes of the latter part of the 19th century in Marblehead. Next slide. So fishing was waning, shoemaking was also dying out. But by the end of the 19th century, the sea regained its dominance as the source of Marblehead's livelihood because, next slide, because of sailing and yacht clubs and summer residence and tourism. So this this became a source of a livelihood for many people in Marblehead. Next slide. Watching the sailboat races was very popular in the summer. This is a photograph from 1892, and the people are out on Marblehead Neck watching the end of a race that was coming from Vineyard Haven to Marblehead, and the vessel is called the Constellation. Next slide. The Marblehead sort of established its prominence as a sailing, eventually the yachting capital, with this first race in 1885, I think it is. The Puritan was a vessel sailing under the colors of the Eastern Yacht Club, and that won the America's Cup. And so, next slide. In the late 19th century, or the latter part of the 19th century, the three main yacht clubs were established: the Eastern Yacht Club, the Corinthian Yacht Club, and the Boston Yacht Club. And this, as I say, brought a lot of people. Marblehead's harbor is perfect for sailing yachts. And it's sort of interesting to think that the size of these yachts is similar to the size of the fishing schooners that populated the harbor 100 years before. But these people came, as I say, to sail. They brought their boats and kept them for the summer. Next slide. And many hotels and restaurants were built along the, and you can see the concentration is up along at the end of Front Street. So there was the Leslie Inn and the Glover Inn, and the New Fountain Inn, and then the Rockmere was down on at Skinner's Head, and then quite a few out on Marblehead Neck. The train brought people to Marblehead. To go to to stay at the hotels, and there was a horse-drawn trolley which brought people from the train station down to where the hotels were and where the restaurants were. Many people came to stay for the summer, or they came to stay for a longer time. One of the great advantages of the whole industrial revolution was that this created jobs for people, and where they actually worked and had a day off. So they got paid every week, and they had a day when they could take the train and they could go to the seaside for the day. And of course, for farmers and fishermen, they didn't have days off. So this was a whole new thing that actually created all the amusement parks in the United States, and Revere and Coney Island and all that were built in the latter part of the 19th century as a direct result of the Industrial Revolution and people having the money and the desire to go out of the city and get some fresh air. Next slide. So these are some of the hotels. Both of these, I think, were on Marblehead Neck, and this is the Devereux train station, where most of the tourist visitors stopped at the Devereux station. Next slide. So now we're coming to the end of the 19th century, and certainly so many changes with technology, with ways of making a livelihood. One of the at the very end of the 19th century, the Spanish-American War, and this was certainly the shortest war, but in American history, the official. But it was about the fight was with Spain, but it was over Cuba and the colony, which was a colony of Spain, and so that Cuba was fighting for its independence. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the Rough Riders, and so some of his fame came from the Spanish-American War. There's some the war was exactly why it started, and the U.S. the Maine, which was a United States battleship, was blown up, and this incident was really taken as a sort of battle cry, rallying cry, and remember that Maine, the hell with Spain, brought the United States into the war, which, as I say, was only lasted for 10 months, but have made some significant changes in the way that the shaping of the politics to go into the 20th century. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had really established itself as it was becoming a real world power, and this was just one more example of that. Next slide. So this photograph is of the last town crier, whose name was Nathaniel Bliss, and this is sort of symbolic of the end of sort of a lot of the old ways that had been existing in Marblehead and in the United States for a long time, because, as I say, of technology. There was no need for a town crier anymore, because there were newspapers, there were telegraphs, and there were ways for people to communicate with each other that were better than a town crier. The 1876, the 100 years of the establishment of the United States, was a major landmark, because many people thought that it might be a great idea, but it wouldn't last very long, and so it did. And as I say, it was on the brink of really becoming a world power. So the century ended, and Marblehead looked forward to the new century with great anticipation. Next slide. So that is the 19th century at top speed, but the new exhibit, which is about Marblehead in the 20th century and beyond, will be opening July 8th. There is a reception, as Chris mentioned, on the evening of July 8th, which is a Friday, and that will be from 5 to 7 in the evening. And the exhibit will be open Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and we hope that you will all come to see it. And thank you very much for listening tonight.
Thank you.
All right. With that, thank you, Pam, and the rest of the Historical Commission here for joining us tonight. If anyone has any questions for Pam and the team, now is the time. So feel free to unmute your mic if you have a question, and let us know. Anyone? In the chat that I'll share with you here. Virginia Whelan asks, was there a skin or leather source in Marblehead to support the shoe industry?
A lot of Peabody was actually the leather capital. And so I think that most of the the leather was purchased from there. Marblehead was, most of the towns had a specialty of what kinds of shoes that they made. And then Marblehead specialized in women's and children's shoes. And that was a little bit thinner leather, smaller sizes, and may have been slightly less expensive materials per pair of shoes. But that was what, but as I say, I think that primarily it all was, because the leather needed to be tanned and prepared and made soft enough. But they certainly bought the raw materials of the leather, and then they had all their tools they had and cut everything out and stitch the shoes.
All right. Any other questions for us? You can also use the chat box below to submit a question if you would like.
Roger is raising his hand.
All right, Roger, go right ahead.
Thank you. And Pam, thank you so much for a very informative talk. Frederick Douglass visited Marblehead and gave talks twice. How much information is there about what he said and where he said it and when he said it?
Well, actually, I can refer you to Jarrett, who did a wonderful program 2 weeks ago, and he talked about Frederick Douglass. But
Sure.
I know that there are newspaper articles, and you can search the Marblehead Reporter. That's online through the Abbott Library, and I don't know if there's transcripts of the actual speeches, but there's and Jarrett, you might know that. Are there transcripts of?
So in terms of Frederick Douglass visiting here, you can actually to the Marblehead Museum website under our BIPOC resources page, our Black, Indigenous, People of Color, our resources page. We actually have a page there for Frederick Douglass's visits to Marblehead. He spoke here 3 times over a two-year period in the 1840s. We don't know exactly what he said, but the Marblehead Messenger newspaper did report on his speeches primarily in the 1890s when Frederick Douglass died. There were Marbleheaders such as J.J.H. Gregory who published remembrances of Frederick Douglass, and from those we know a little bit about the subjects of his speeches and with some of the public reaction to his speeches, which did include a little bit of mob activity, anti-abolition mobs who were in Marblehead. So you can check that out on our BIPOC page.
Yeah, there are also some biographies of Douglass that have excerpts of, that may not be, there's not the specific speeches that he gave in Marblehead, but they're excerpts of some of the speeches that he gave, and they discuss what his topics were.
Thank you.
We have another question in the chat from Gordon. He's wondering when they can expect to see the permanent exhibit in the Abbott Hall Museum.
Well, that's a good question. And I don't think that there's a specific date. Chris, do you want to respond to that at all?
Sure. At this point, what we have going on is a concept study to see 2 things. First of all, what do we need to do structurally to Abbott Hall to make it suitable for a museum in the attic? Ed Nilsson has done a lot of work on that for us, along with experts in several of the areas that are necessary. We also have a museum design team led by Helen Riegel, working on basically the concepts of how the museum would be laid out, what the flow might be, the notional ideas of what might be shown in the museum. As far as how long it's going to take, we expect to finish the concept study sometime this year. When we then decide to proceed is a little up in the air, but there's going to be a fundraising time period. And if we're real lucky, we'll be able to raise all the money that's needed for it. If we're not real lucky, we may ask the town for some help as well. When would that be? I would expect at least a couple of years. Does that answer your question?
Do we have any other questions here for the team? All right. If not, I just want to end our time together today with an invitation to you all to continue our 19th century discussion at the museum next month. On Thursday, July 14 at 7 p.m., I'll be leading a lecture at the museum called Marblehead in Motion, the Victorian Bicycle Boom. It's going to be a lecture about the social impact of the bicycle in Marblehead with a special focus on how it liberated life for women. So if you'd like to join us for that, you can check out the Marblehead Museum website on our upcoming programs page, where you'll see more info about the lecture and where you can get tickets. So with that, thanks again to the Marblehead Historical Commission team, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Jared, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Garrett. Yeah.
Yep,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Thank you.